We just wanted to say good morning to everyone who's joining, and good afternoon or evening to folks who might be joining us from other areas of the world. We're very excited to have you in attendance this morning for GSDI's third webinar of our bi-monthly webinar event series. Each month we dive into a topic related to global social development. In this month, we're focusing on cross-sectoral programs for youth development, the rationale process, and possible outcomes. And as we're getting started, please feel to respond to the question posed on this slide, letting us know your name, title, and where in the world you are joining from in the chat function. And then prior to introducing our panelists, I do want to offer some Zoom considerations. I know that we're very familiar with this given the virtual world that we are in, but as we progress, I just kindly ask that you have your video remain off to ensure your microphone is muted throughout the duration. This will minimize any on-screen distractions and reduce any on-screen stimuli for all attendees. Following our panelist presentations, we'll have an interactive Q&A session, and we'd love for this to be interactive. So you do have one of two options. You can either turn your video on if comfortable. This is a smaller format. You can unmute and ask your question directly, or you can post your question in the chat. I will be monitoring that throughout the presentation today. And for those new attendees to our webinar series, we do want to welcome you, and we're so excited to have you engage in this forum with us. To provide some context, Global Social Development Innovations, or GSDI, is a research center at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We're situated within the School of Social Work. And the center was officially recognized by the university in 2017, and it was built with the intention of creating sustainable change for the world's most economically and socially marginalized youth populations through collaborative research, practice, and policy. We work in collaboration with research, implementing, and funding partners, and the center's research is oriented around three core areas: youth economic security, youth workforce development, and youth financial inclusion. Our projects employ rigorous methods that generate evidence to advance youth well-being globally. And we have both active and completed projects that span countries in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, including Ghana, India, Kenya, South Africa, Uganda, and Zambia. Collectively, the center has over 40 years of experience in tackling systemic causes of poverty and optimizing young people's access to education and employment. So without further ado, let's meet our panelists. We have joining us Dr. Audrey Marie Moore, who's a senior researcher at Mathematica, and she joins us with her more than 15 years of experience working in international development. She is a recognized expert in the areas of primary and secondary education and youth and workforce development. Dr. Moore specializes in designing and implementing research and evaluation of the international programs and has extensive experience implementing education programs abroad. She currently serves as the lead technical advisor for advancing the Positive Youth Development Learning Agenda under the USAID-funded Youth Power 2 Learning and Evaluation Program. Audrey has worked in more than 14 countries across Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, as well as in the US. Our second panelist is Dr. Peter Joyce, who is a senior advisor on youth and workforce for the USAID Kenya and East Africa mission. He's recognized as an expert on the challenges associated with the evolving global labor market and with youth employment and prosperity. Dr. Joyce's work focuses on researching, evaluating, and building innovative practices that link education and work, and his unique perspective draws on more than 30 years of experience in both the public and private sector. Our final panelist joining us is Gigi Gaddy, and she works for Grameen Foundation USA and is the Technology for Development Director and leads Grameen's Technology Innovation and Technical Services teams. Gigi has over 25 years of work experience in the IT development, banking, insurance, and microfinance industries. She holds an MBA in computer science degrees, is a certified microfinance expert, and a certified information systems auditor. She has been an active contributor to the IT, microfinance, and financial inclusion communities as a resource speaker, facilitator, or moderator for various conferences and international events. In her current role, Gigi explores the ways in which data and technology can be harnessed to empower women and youth to be digital finance agents in their communities. So to kick us off, I will turn it over to Audrey.
Thank you so much, Miranda. I'm so honored to be here today to be able to talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing. My presentation is really going to focus on the rationale, the progress, and some of the outcomes that we're seeing as we've increasingly moved to focus on cross-sectoral youth programming. Next slide, Miranda. So I want to start with just a quote. At the end of the USAID-funded Youth Power project, we did a task order review across more than 11 youth projects. And I love this quote from one of the Youth Power implementers that says that the big benefit of doing cross-sectoral work is being able to address the challenges that the individual or household is facing comprehensively. There's not one thing that makes one vulnerable. It's a set of factors: HIV, poverty, education, all of these work together. So it's hugely beneficial for a project to be able to come in and use a comprehensive approach. So when we're thinking about cross-sectoral program, I looked at a number of different theories of change. And what we really look at is that when you invest in cross-sectoral programming, I think it helps us really achieve the outcomes across sectors that affect youth. It helps them develop a comprehensive set of assets and skills that allow them to contribute to their communities and really help the communities to long-term progress and international development. And I want to note that a lot of the work that I've done has been with Making Sense International and the USAID funded Youth Power and Youth Power 2 programs. And so I think I come at this cross-sectoral approach from a very positive youth development lens. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as I go through the presentation. So next slide. So before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about how we define positive youth development or in cross-sectoral, not positive youth development, cross-sectoral programming. So when you see this word cloud, you'll see a lot of big words like collaboration and leveraging across sectors, resources, integrated. These are all words that cut across a number of definitions. So USAID defines cross-sectoral programming as efforts that intentionally leverage resources, networks, and expertise across a number of development sectors in a collaborative fashion to respond to complex development challenges. There's a number of other donors and organizations that define cross-sectoral programming as an intentional approach that links the design, delivery, and evaluation of programs across sectors to provide amplified, lasting impact on people's lives. And yet another group focuses more on that cross-sector collaboration, emphasizing the engagement of one or two or more organizations that bring their funding together so that they can mutually develop outcomes and move a program towards those outcomes. So while there's a lot of different lenses coming into how we define cross-sectoral program, I think that across these definitions, the idea of collaboration and pulling the best resources from all these different sectors to address the whole youth is really what we're trying to get at. So next slide. So I think that really feeds into the kind of rationale. And while there's a number of different rationales for why we do cross-sectoral programming, I'm going to focus really on three. The first one is that when you think of, for example, entering the workforce, there's not one program or one policy that's really going to solve the problem. You've got to be able to address the education component, the working in the workforce component. You need to have somebody with a lot of different kinds of soft skills. They need to be healthy. So already you can see that one of the challenges with programs that focus on maybe just education or just health are missing these different areas. And so over the last decade, we've seen a lot of movement from donors and implementers towards this desire to really recognize more holistic programming. And we've seen the rise of positive youth development, of the adolescent well-being indexes that are being used to kind of drive these programs. We also know that youth are the catalysts for their communities. And the idea that the lives of youth themselves are cross-sectoral, they're very multidimensional, they're growing in a very rapid way, and they need to be able to tap into different kinds of social institutions, such as family, schools, the labor market, housing, health, culture. So you see all these kind of cross-cutting elements, and it really provides a rationale for why we want to move more towards cross-sectoral programming. Next slide. So looking across some of the literature, there's four big elements that we see that have really made cross-sectoral programming effective at reaching some of their outcomes. The first one is that cross-sectoral approaches are rooted in this idea of positive youth development. So it's moving from the level of creating skills for youth, giving them agency or confidence and soft skills to um, contribute to their communities. It's engaging them in the work that they do in their communities. And then these programs also then focus on the enabling environment, whether that's at the policy level and putting in place policies and programs that support youth, to how the different systems within the youth that youth have to interact with come together. The second effective element has been really creating a common language and using frameworks that bring people together, because within the sectors of, education and health, we all use different lingo and different ways of referring to youth development or the elements of international development. So having a framework that we can come together and have that common language really helps make these programs successful. And then another common element that's helped these programs be successful is really this interaction among youth and adults. So being able to have safe spaces where youth can come and have adults to work with, to confide in, to trust in, to interact with each other is another element that makes these programs successful. So next slide, Miranda. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about an example of what I think is a really successful cross-sectoral program. So the Mozambique Programa para o Futuro was a USAID-funded program that used PEPFAR funding to support youth in Mozambique. Specifically, the program was implemented by FHI 360 in the city of Beira, and eventually over time it did expand into Maputo. The program was specifically focused on orphans and vulnerable children from ages 15 to 17 who had lost at least one parent and met the government eligibility criteria for economic vulnerability. What made this program cross-sectoral was really the approach that it used to helping these youth. It used an integrated project-based learning curriculum that developed soft skills like critical thinking, teamwork, problem solving. It taught them financial literacy in terms of how to do family budgets, how to develop business plans so that they could develop their own entrepreneurial activities, how to deal with loan costs, how to communicate, including public speaking, negotiating, how to interview for jobs. It dealt with a lot of the social and life and health issues that the OVC youth kind of dealt with: gender discrimination, the stigma, taught them a lot about family planning. And it had brought in the information and communication technology component in terms of how they can use those for business purposes, to develop resumes and to connect with e-mentoring. And they also had this opportunity to do a lot of work with internships and job shadowing. So it connected all of these different elements from different sectors into one place and provided a safe space for the youth to learn these. Next slide. So the elements that made this program really successful was first that tie back to that creation of a safe space. It was a place where youth could come together and learn the skills from these different sectors that they needed to succeed and have that safe and supportive environment with facilitators that were specialists in the different sectors. So it wasn't someone who just had education expertise or just help. They made sure that the experts were drawing, and had experience across these different sectors so that they could help the youth grow. And it gave them a space where they could really talk about some of the challenges and the stigmas and the gender discrimination that they were feeling with one another. And it helped them develop those feelings of belonging that were really essential to that kind of holistic development of youth. It had the multidisciplinary staff. It also provided a routine and stability for the youth that they didn't really have in their life outside of this safe space. The integrated curriculum was really that cross-sectoral piece, and then that it drew on multiple sectors and multiple types of stakeholders from health centers to the private sector to help the youth develop the kinds of skills that they needed. Next slide. So the challenges that we still face, and these are numerous, while we have really moved into more and more cross-sectoral programs from the technical approach, we still have a lot of funding silos. So many of these programs, and the Mozambique Programa para o Futuro is one of them, they tend to be very sector funded as opposed to cross-sector funded. So it would to have truly cross-sectoral programs, we need to have cross-sectoral funding so that there are incentives and investment from all of the sectors in these programs. And there are still, it can be really challenging for donors and in particular and governments to kind of break down some of the bureaucratic difficulties that are associated with having the sectors themselves be able to co-fund programs. And I think that that's really a challenge that we're still trying to contend with within the youth sector. Having clear communication among stakeholders can be really challenging. That ties back to that need for really clear communication and a common language for folks to come together around. And, we talk a lot about the success of cross-sectoral programs, and certainly, we see that in programs like Programa para o Futuro, but there is still a lack of impact and evaluation and research on the real impacts these programs can have. And, one of the challenges associated with doing these impact evaluations is related to the outcomes and the designs of the programs themselves. A lot of times programs bring different components, different aspects of sectors together. So it can be really hard to compare an education and democracy program to a health and education program to a program that's just, one sector based. And so I think there's still a lot of work for us to do around how we really effectively measure the impacts of these programs and learn what really makes these effective. And then the political economy and incentive structures, I think, can still be a challenge. What is the incentive for the different sectors to work together, to come together around these different programs, and understanding how those incentives function within a youth system is still difficult. So I think that leads me to the last slide, which is, we still face a lot of gaps in evidence. Again, the lack of impact evaluation, I won't talk about again, but we also know that there's a lot of desire to engage the private sector, and there are programs that do it very effectively. But we also know that it can be a challenge to bring in private sector into donor or other social programs. And so how we better involve and integrate the private sector into these cross-sectoral programs is an area that can use a lot more research. To what extent cross-sectoral program is more cost-effective than single sector programs. There's a lot of work that can still be done around the cost and cost analysis of these programs. And then how we address and overcome some of these structural, institutional, and incentive challenges is also an area to really create these integrated technical and cross-sector funded programs is an area that needs more focus. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to my colleague, Peter, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Great. Thanks, Audrey. That was a great lead in. I want to say hello to everybody and thanks for taking time to join this discussion. I want to certainly give a shout out to the UNC team. They're always a pleasure to work with, particularly Miranda. That's not to say it's not a pleasure to work with the other folks on the team, Gina and others. So Miranda, I'm going to try and move quickly because of time. You want to go right to the slide of the well? There you go. There's a number of things I was going to sort of drive home, but I think, Audrey, you did a great job providing a framework around this idea of cross-sectoral, or in some cases people call it integrated approaches. And I'm going to spend a fair bit of time kind of talking about your point number 4 on your last slide, which is some of the structural barriers. So I'm going to begin with a short little tale, and then I'm going to kind of give you a peek behind the scenes at what we're doing at the mission level in country from a USAID perspective. And then I'm going to give you a little personal commentary that I just can't help doing and would love to get some reactions to. So let me begin with a short tale that I was told when I started my career. And it's stuck with me for a long time. And it basically is a short story about a village that had a 30-foot dry well, a well that had been dry. And there were a number of children playing around it. And one of the children fell to the bottom of the well, so 30 feet down. And as the news spread throughout the community, everybody came running. Folks from the shops, the school, the hospital, the church, parents and youth, and they all came running to help, and they all brought short pieces of rope, about 1 foot long. And they stood at the top of the well with these 1 foot ropes trying to pull the poor child out. And of course, that doesn't work. So the real answer is, as someone pointed out, is to tie the ropes together. And that sounds so simple. It sounds so logical, but it is such a challenge given the way that we've operated for a very, very long time. And I think that's really the essence of what we're talking about today. So Miranda, let's go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit. So I think, there's a lot of terminology that gets used, holistic approach, cross-sectoral, integrated, systems building, systems shaping, but you all know what it is. It's the representation of each of those ropes, from mental health services to education to mental and physical well-being, employment, family, community. They all come together, and that's where the power is. So next slide. And this is just a short diagram that comes. There's a number of resources I was going to point out. One of them is a piece that was done on cross-sectoral approaches. And this just sort of shows how at the mission level, we talk about sort of country impact. And we have each of the missions in USAID have a country development cooperative strategy that looks at 5 years, and we're in the midst of doing one right now in Kenya, redoing the one that has operated. We've been operating on for the past 5 years. But you can see that the idea is this strategies as you go up, and they should all come together to have a measurable impact and on sustainability as well in the country. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll sort of tell our tale from the mission. By the way, I've been at the mission for 2 years, and a lot of work had been done beforehand. This was really my first stint at USAID. But back in 2007, when all this talk about cross-sectoral came up, we did a cross-sectoral assessment. And I know there's some folks here from Making Sense or from the Youth Power Learning team, and they've done numerous analysis, over the years. But the basic model is that you do a desk review and then you do some focus groups. And in 2007, we did focus groups with young people in order to enable the youth voice. And as a result of that work, we established in 2009 about a 60 million, $70 million investment in the country called Yes Youth Can. And it established, it began to look at it, at organizing youth. Because in 2007 there was a national election and there was a lot of violence involved after the results were released, and many youth were involved in that. And so there was a need from the assessment that youth needed to have more of a voice in the governance of their communities, of their county, and at the national level. And so we established youth bunges, which basically translates into parliamentarians, although they're not associated with government. They're independent entities, and that they would provide the youth with a voice and shape some of the policies and practices in communities. So then in 2014, we did another assessment. Again, same sort of approach, a desk review and then focus groups. And the number one issue facing young people, at least from their voice, was employment. No surprise. And so we began a journey where we started investing in technical training and also continuing to build these youth networks. And so we launched a program called the Kenyan Youth Employment and Skills Program, which worked at the county level because in 2010 there was a new constitution which involved the devolution of many of the policies and practices and funds from a national level to a county level. And so technical training was now being operated by the counties, and this initiative helped build their capacity. But also we established what we called compacts, which were formal entities consisting of stakeholders that serve youth communities. So private sector, NGOs that serve youth, education, technical training, the county government, and they met and they created a work plan from which they operated. Generation Kenya was a global initiative that USAID as an agency was investing in to disrupt the training efforts by really making it much more demand driven. And so the mission put some money into that work to stand up a Generation Kenya. Let me go to the next one, and this is where my part of the story begins. So I joined the mission in about 2019, and after the first 30 days and reading back on all these assessments, it had been 5 years since we did an assessment, and so we began to sort of speculate what we could do, and I went back to the fellow from the University of Massachusetts who conducted the first assessment back in 2007. And I asked him, Ash, if you were to do this again, what would you do differently? And he said, we involved youth in the focus groups, but really, if youth are going to own the agenda, they need to be involved from the very beginning, from the design straight on through. And they need to lead, and they need to manage and therefore own the youth agenda. And so that's what we did. We tried our hardest to do an assessment that was done differently. It was cross-sectoral in that we looked at information from across the board in all the different areas, whether it was health, whether it was gender related, whether it was education. So we did that desk review, and then we actually worked with an organization that helped lead and conduct youth-led focus groups. And what we did was we focused on the notion of vulnerability, and we asked young people what vulnerability meant. And I won't go into the detail. There is a report that you can take a look at, and basically it involves sort of 10 elements. And as you would expect, they really are sort of cross-sectoral. Let me also tell you that, and making sense in youth power learning was very helpful in this because we hit a pandemic, of course. And so we had to do all this virtually, which was really a challenge. But but I was intrigued because I know Gigi's going to talk a little bit about digitalization. Um, we did this whole darn thing at a distance, and it seemed to me that there's some lessons there where we shouldn't have to wait 5 years to tap the voices of young people in our cross-sectoral approaches or our integrated approaches. We should be able to do it just in time on a regular basis, because we struggled during the pandemic to find out what was happening for young people. And I think through the assessment, we were able to do that because we'd run focus groups using WhatsApp, and we'd schedule them for an hour and a half, and they typically would go over another hour. And then young people asked if they could still stay on the network so they could continue sharing and talking with one another. So that's one piece. The other I want to just mention, at the mission, we launched what we call a tiger team. I know there's no tigers in Kenya, they're lions. The idea of a tiger team comes from NASA when they were trying to figure out how to problem solve, and they brought a diversity of thought and representatives together. And so we have a unit, a team that I conduct right now, and it represents members of all the different units. And we're really trying to look at how we can work collectively in a country where 85% of the population is under the age of 35. So I don't care what sector it is or what operating unit, it should be thinking about youth in a strong way. And we're redoing our CDCS, as I alluded to before, and we're looking at development objectives in sort of a multi-sectoral way. So we're trying to blend various aspects of integrated programming. Let's go to the next slide. Let me see where we are. So I mentioned the assessment, and two products came out of that. One is sort of a traditional desk review resource that has all kinds of data and things in it. What's interesting, of course, is some of the data was collected before the pandemic, and so some of that data has changed, which shows the challenge we have in sort of a cross-sectoral approach. If we're going to build it on evidence or data, how do we make sure that that data is relevant? And then the second component is actually focused on youth. I know the New York Times talks about graphic narratives. Some people would say a comic book, but this is a piece that we put together with some of the data, with some of the findings from youth-led design sessions that we ran virtually, where they generated solutions to some of these problems. And so that piece is now in the hands of many youth leaders and communities that are looking at how vulnerability plays out in their county and what are some of the potential approaches to addressing some of that. All right, next slide. So just some final thoughts. I mean, I think that Audrey, you covered many of these. I mean, part of the cross-sectoral barrier, I guess, is, there are no designated youth funds in the agency. Funds come from earmarks, whether it's education or health. And so, the youth programs are typically, if there are youth programs in a mission, they're usually drawn from the education earmark. And most of the education earmark is either aimed at basic education, literacy, or higher ed. And so youth fit into those, but if you want to do something more creative, that's you need to leverage some of those funds. That's not to say that there aren't youth-related activities happening under PEPFAR or under governance, et cetera. But bringing them together, tying the ropes together, is challenging in a mission for a number of different reasons. And as I said, the CDC, given the fact that 80% of the population is under the age of 35, the mission directors really charged the full mission to really look at youth front and center, and particularly young adolescent girls as well. And then my fourth piece is really, the fact that there is, in echoing Audrey's sentiment, there is a need for research. And we've got to make a strong case for what the measurable impacts are and advantages are to a more integrated approach. And I think when we do that, I think we can then change some of the structural barriers that exist. Um, this is sort of a kind of a wild card slide, I guess. And so, we've all been on lockdown as a result of this pandemic. And so I don't think there's a conversation I have with anyone that doesn't start with something around, COVID and how you're doing, et cetera, et cetera. And we've all, right now, everybody's focused on the vaccine. And for a long time, I've admired kind of the way that the medical or the health arena has worked, the health field. We probably won't ever develop a youth vaccine, if you will, but I often think about what are the lessons that can be drawn from the successes in this field to the youth field. And so, one of my first, the second thought on here is that, we've invested substantially in health and education programs. Basic ed, we've done a lot on literacy and measuring literacy rates and reading levels and things of that nature. And it has driven the program. And I think it's led to much success and much credibility in the field. But most donors don't really have targeted funds, quote unquote, for youth. And I think with the current push globally with donor communities is much more around economics and trade when it comes to international development. And so I'm concerned. I don't know how much closer we'll ever get to doing something where there's targeted funds for youth. But obviously, where there are funds, as they apply to youth and they can integrate, I think that's where we really need to kind of focus on impact. Science and research has been the driver of solutions in the medical and health arena. They also have done a great job with networking, whereby they have formal associations and they share research and collaboration. It doesn't happen so much in the youth field. At least that's my perspective. It gets better, but it's a very competitive business when it comes to large funds and even private foundations as well. And the health field has been a leader really in the recognition of the whole person. And they've begun to forge more cross-sectoral connections. And I mentioned to Audrey that I think some of that has really happened on the domestic side for many years. And so I think there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from that earlier work. And so from my standpoint, I mean, I think that we need to establish a more formal recognized field with connections to related fields. I think there needs to be a funding commitment to youth. And it's going to be a long time, probably from an agency standpoint or from many of the donors to do that. I think that's where philanthropy comes in, private foundations and individuals that can help stand up some of these activities and demonstrate impact for. And again, I think we have to begin to emphasize research so that things that we do in design are evidence-based. And more importantly, given the early stages of the field, it needs to be evidence producing. And we need to create an open and formal network and associations for collective impact. Folks that are trying to tie the ropes together in different villages need to come together and learn what's worked and what hasn't worked. And finally, we need to formally engage youth as much as possible. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sorry, Gigi, went over a little bit, I think, but I'll hand it off to you.
No worries, Peter. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Gigi Gatti, and I will be sharing, with you my thoughts on the role of technology in youth development. Next slide, please. So just for you, for those who are not familiar with Grameen Foundation, Grameen Foundation is a US-based nonprofit. We are a very small organization, and we are really rooted from the work of Professor Yunus, who started the microfinance movement. Our difference is really that from the onset, the foundation was set up with digital technology and data in mind. That is what differentiates Grameen Foundation from the rest of the Grameen movement, if I may put it that way. Having said that, I just want to clarify that we are not associated with the bank. We are the international arm that was set up to basically support the microfinance movement outside of Bangladesh. Next slide, please. I will spend a little bit more time, in this slide, and following the points where where Audrey and Peter was talking about cross-sectoral. I just wanted to share with you some of the signature programs of Grameen Foundation that may or may not involve youth, but we are looking at the role of youth actively in all of these signature programs. Um, One is the digital farming, which basically means that we support the use of technology tools, in farming. And most of these farming households are rural. The next one, as I will share with you in terms of a case, are what we call the community agents. So community agents are basically human touch points, in their communities that are digitally enabled. And what I can say right now is that community agents in the past were normally people who were, older, more trusted in the community. But once you digitally enable an agent, it really opens up a lot of opportunities for the youth. I will get back to that, using a case later on. And of course, we are also looking at the community lift, where a single agent can actually support multiple people, whether they are multiple people and households, uh, whether it's in farming, whether it's in financial services or in health. And of course, lastly, the use of mobile money and other mobile channels, of payment as well. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to define first, when we talk about use of technology. Um, when we say technology, sometimes what happens is that we're automatically looking at, thinking about computers, about mobile tools, about tablets. But it is, in fact, a very wide range of applications and devices. And this include the things that I have listed here, including radio. Yes, it might sound obsolete, but radio plays a very important role, especially in rural communities. The use of SMS and integrated voice response, smart cards, mapping systems, and it can go as much as specialized devices such as drones, solar grids, soil samplers. E-learning solutions are particularly important for youth, as well as other software solutions that are out there. When what is what is scary about the use of technology is we know what we know as the obsolescence rate. By the time that a new technology is out there, by the time you buy your mobile phone, you know it is already 3 months obsolete. So the cycle of technology, the obsolescence cycle is very, very high, such that we really need to be able to maximize the use of technology, but at the same time not think about rapidly changing the technology items that we are using. And I know that I might be contradicting, the way that ICT professionals are saying we always have to use new technology. In my experience, using technology as a tool for development, that is actually not the case. We need to use the technology that matters most. We don't have to change our devices every now and then, just because there's something flashy coming out there. And this is also disrupting, that knowledge trend that we want to be able to see, and that adoption if we keep on changing from one technology to the other. So next slide, please. So in terms of development and in terms of youth development in particular, is technology then the sweet spot? So my answer is no. And that might surprise a lot of you who are in this, session today. And there are particular nuances in the use of technology. One is that what we call the digital divide, the access and the challenges, and the barriers towards mobile ownership, digital literacy, and access to data is real, especially for young girls and young women. So we are still seeing that ownership and access to digital devices is particularly much lower in girls and young women. So we need to address that gap before we can say that really technology can bridge the gap. The second point, and which is basically what um, my colleagues, who presented, Peter and Audrey, uh, is technology is only the enabler. We understand that cross-cutting and ecosystem and market systems need is important, and oftentimes technology only connects the dots and is an enabler and not the solution in itself. So we have seen a lot of programs, for instance, wherein technology is the center of it all. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. um, what it is that the human component and all the other things that you have to consider are very important as well. And lastly, and more importantly, the unintended consequences of using technology. We need to understand deeply data privacy issues. There are also issues that are stemming from collecting data and not being able to secure that data. There are also issues about cyberbullying, especially for women and young girls. So these are some of the unintended consequences. The other one is actually expanding the digital divide is also another unintended consequences. So what I'm saying here is that technology can help. Yes, definitely. It is something that we cannot avoid, but we need to be able to manage it rather than saying that it is the core solution to our programs. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is just to give you a little bit of a taste of how we incorporate youth in some of our programs in Grameen Foundation, just to have a couple of different uh, cases, so to speak, to share. So when I talked about digital finance agents, I'm actually talking about women, predominantly women. About 75% of our agents are what we call digital finance agents that are basically mobile enabled. Yeah, they either have tablets or Android phones, and they are trained to reach rural households and women groups to offer save to offer savings, money transfers, government payments. So these are all basically digital products, digital financial products. And by doing so, these agents generate income and connect communities to financial services. So in India, we have a program called Women Link. 87% of mitras are young women, and by young, I'm defining it here as 35 years and below. In the Philippines, we have a case wherein at the start of a program, agents were averaging 40 years of age, but within 2 years, it fell down to 38. We are looking at it from a trending perspective that the more successful agents rather are getting younger and younger. We have savings groups in Bidi refugee camp in Uganda who are using what we call our LedgerLinks platform. It is a mobile platform that Grameen Foundation had developed, and 50% of the savings groups are actually youth. So that's very heartwarming to see that in some of our programs, really we are seeing the trend, of young people being able to drive the boat, so to speak. And where technology is used, it's used in a lot of things. It's used in profiling and selection of these agents. This is why we know, how old they are, how they are, performing. Of course, the tablet and the mobile apps, or the point of sale devices rather, are digital in nature. We use videos, e-learning, SMS, IVR, what I call the multi-channel form of training. Of course, all the products are digital in nature. We have a tool called Ledger Links, which is a savings group tools. It is free to use, by the way. So if you know groups that would like to use it, please, let us know. And also we use it for credit scoring for loans. Now, you will see that technology is used very widely in programs like this, but is it enough? No, it's not enough. We have to train these agents on social skills. We need to look at their access to finance, which is basically how they are capitalizing their business. We need to be able to look at what we call the do no harm principles within Grameen Foundation. For instance, an example of that is our women mitras in India, since they are doing house to house, is it safe for them to be able to do so? If they are still studying, how does this affect their studies, and so on and so forth. So it is not just the use of technology, but really about looking at it from a broader perspective of the whole ecosystem. Next slide, please. And we have also very good indications about using digital tools with farmers, not just in Ghana, but in Cote d'Ivoire and in India as well. So we have a program, a tool actually called the Farm Development Plan, that is used by cocoa traders in Ghana to provide extension services to cocoa farming households. Where we use the technology is in agriculture extension services, developing long-term farm investment plans, and we are talking about a 7-year profit and loss for the farm, monitoring, of course, the adherence to the plan, and SMS reminders, regarding the execution of the plan. This is pretty an interesting case for me because about 82% of young farmers, again, our peg here is about 35 and below, are easier to agree to the plan versus 79 of older farmers. You may say, oh, that's not a very big difference. Yes, it is, because the average age of the older farmers here is about 57, 58. So what it is really is, if you're using a digital tool and you're talking to the farmer, the younger farmers are easily persuaded, and they can actually be easily convinced that, hey, my farm actually has potential as a business, rather than the older farms. And so they are very excited to work with the extension officers on how to make their farming more profitable. So in the adherence of the plan, although we saw that older farmers have a higher improvement rates on all 14 recommendations that the tool is giving the farmer, the younger farmers are actually interestingly focused more on recommendations that trigger higher productivity rates. What does that tell me? It tells me basically that they are understanding, the difference between all those 14 recommendations, because the coaching is through digital methods is something that they absorb much more. So next slide, please. And lastly, as an example, we are also in the WAGE Consortium, the Women and Girls Empowered Consortium. It is a global consortium composed of Aberoli, SIPE, Grameen Foundation, and Search for Common Ground. Where we are looking at here is a more holistic approach, in terms of gender-based violence, women's economic empowerment, and peace and security. Um, Now, in this particular consortium, there is very little technology used. Technology is used to act for access to finance, to for the women economics empowerment. This is through crowdsourcing with Kiva. Some of you are probably familiar with the Kiva platform. And the Grameen for Learning, it's an e-learning curriculum. An example of that is our Resilient Life, Resilient Business curriculum, which was also very effectively used during the COVID-19 for microfinance clients who were not able to meet. So we were able to use the same learning tool um, to provide mentoring or coaching because the women members cannot meet physically. So in this particular, in the wage program, there are many things that you have to look at, just like at what Audrey and Peter were saying. You know, we need to look at, for instance, legal, access to legal barriers, to legal uh, issues, peace and security issues, gender equality issues, and these are all not being able to use digital means for now, but we are slowly looking at really ramping up the digital use for women's economic empowerment in this case. Next slide, please. So my last slide is really just tying up, the top three. There are many, but I chose the top three design considerations for youth when using a digital. Number one is that we need to understand technology access and adoption constraints. And I'm talking about the digital divide here, especially for young girls. So we need to be intentional from the start that we are not contributing to that digital divide and that we should be using technology that actually works out there, even if it's an obsolete technology. People laugh at me sometimes because I also, can your platform use USSD? And sometimes the very high tech technology providers, say, what USSD? Where are you gonna use that? Well, only about in 80% of African countries. It's like, you know, we still need to use the technology that works out there, not the most flashy. So we need to be intentional from the start. We need to use multiple reinforcing channels and human networks as well. And this is very important because, it is not just one tool, but it's also complemented by radio programs, by SMS, by social media. So that mix of different multiple reinforcing channels and trusted human networks is very important when we want to expedite the adoption of technology. And lastly, we need to unlock other barriers and create an enabling environment to improve youth livelihoods. I believe that youth livelihoods is the key here. If youth can see that within a program, within an intervention, within what they are doing, in the end, that they will have a respectable future, through good livelihood, I think we already have their 50% of their yes, we want to do this. But we need to also look at gender based violence, women's economic empowerment, literacy and digital literacy are two key issues that we need to address because, as I mentioned, there is a gap, and access to finance. Access to finance, in our experience, is very, very much, constrained when we're talking about youth programs. That is why we keep on. We have to keep that cycle of also informing and kind of like influencing funders, that with access to finance, we also have to have youth-centered programs for access to finance, because what we are seeing is that that is a missing, very much missing piece when we are talking about youth micro entrepreneurship to start with. So that's my last slide. And yeah, welcome comments and curiosities as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all our panelists. I appreciate all of your contributions, and we are at the top of the hour, but if there are a few questions that folks have and are able to stay on, I will definitely welcome those.
Ricardo asked a question about why the emphasis on USAID, right? And I think it's a good one. I mean, obviously, for me, it's what I know, but I could tell you all kinds of initiatives from the other bilaterals within Africa, within Kenya, in which we participate. I guess I would say to you, Ricardo, that USAID is one of the world's largest donors. I think we have the resources to try and do some things differently. But at this point, it means pivoting from a long tradition of the way that programs have been funded and operated. And so I tried to give you a little bit of a glimpse of how one donor is trying to shift that, knowing that it's not perfect. I'd be the first one to say so. But I also, in my knowledge of other donors, yes, there's a little bit of activity going on there, but it's hard to kind of tilt in this direction. And that's why I sort of suggest that we really need investments around research and action research, where we're looking at program design and implementation and evaluation, and that be supported by more agile funding sources like private foundations, like philanthropists, that will give us the information we need to help support some of the work that bilateral donors are trying to do in the field.
Yeah, I would add to what Peter is saying. I think the UNICEF does a lot of work with the Adolescent Wellbeing Index and how they integrate that into their programming. I know that the World Bank also draws on, trying to bring in the different sectors to some of their own youth programs, and they do prioritize the importance of the cross-sectoral work, but they face, I think, similar challenges to USAID in terms of pivoting and trying to figure out how to pool those funds and do something that's not just technically integrated but funding integrated. So I think regardless of the donor, I think that is the big challenge.
Thank you.
We have a faculty senate going on, so we might have to leave. So I wanted to ask this question. Since we are a research center and research came up quite a bit. And I think there's Making Sense, there's Mathematica, there's USAID on this webinar. One of the things that I want to find out is what will it take to move a research agenda in impact evaluations of cross-sectoral programming. When we say we should make a strong case, what goes into that case and who should we be bringing to the table and who should lead that? Because I think this question has been, not question, but finding or recommendation has been voiced over and over again for years on end. But I think I'm ready for action. So can we please address that?
Gina, I can address one aspect of it, which is, the doing more research. So I know under Youth Power 2, that's a big priority for USAID and the team at USAID that's leading that. So we will be doing an impact evaluation of a cross-sectoral program in Nigeria that's combining health and workforce. I think one of the challenges, at least from the Youth Power 2 perspective, has, we had this group of programs that went through and they've sort of finished their cycle, and there's another group that's coming through as missions are preparing to release a lot of new implementation programs. I think the opportunity is coming in the next several years to be able to evaluate those programs. So I think our first opportunity is coming, but I think it's also the importance of just making it a priority for all donors, that as we implement these cross-sectoral programs, that we're trying to figure out unique and interesting ways to actually measure those and look at the impact of, what those contributions from the different sectors are bringing. I don't know, Peter, if you would add anything to that.
Well, I just sent a note in the chat to Ricardo because my mind's still churning on his comment. The real challenge here, by the way, is if you're looking at sustainability, it's the governments and the countries that we work with. They're investing a lot of money. They're setting the stage, and oh my gosh, they're as siloed as you can be, both in terms of disciplinary areas, right, that address youth issues. But more importantly, they're also siloed from sort of a national level, which is everything sort of top down to kind of locally owned efforts as well. And so I don't want to make this thing even more complicated, but I think that's a structure we're working in. So we really need innovation. We need to be looking at the gazelles in the safari, the small, agile, quickly moving entities, because they're going to show us the breakthrough strategies. I love UNICEF and the UN, but I got to tell you, as soon as you put a secretariat in charge of something, it kind of fails. And they challenge themselves with the silos. I'm working with UN1 right now in Kenya and globally, and I can see the struggle. So I really think we need some real innovation. I think we got to start small, be small and scrappy, show how this works, test the heck out of it, and demonstrate with real evidence.
Thanks, Peter. So going back to Audrey. I don't want to dominate this, so this will be my last question on this. So to do this well and to whet the appetite of foundations and bilaterals and even research as a whole, is there a way of planning that evaluation in a way that we have all these goals in mind? So as Youth Power 2, really thinking about what are the measurements that we will employ, what are the indicators, who are these findings for, who are we targeting, what is the audience, how do we make this very user-friendly for these different baskets of people, or buckets of people. I think that I'm excited about the opportunity, right? But I think if we don't do it well, then we'll go back to where we've been, where we're just talking about, yes, we need research, and folks don't have the appetite to do it.
Mm-hmm. And I would add that on the dissemination side, it becomes really important because, if you're just creating a report that, gets put on a shelf, that's not going to help. So we need to, and I think that, under YP2, we're really thinking about creative ways of highlighting research through infographics, through, the platforms, using technology to get out information. And, yes, I think that it is important to take those considerations as we're kind of looking at the design. And we're also pulling, a number of people in from the consortia under Youth Power 2 to think creatively about this design and how that, how we can make sure that it's done really well. So I think it's a much more intentional approach. And so hopefully that will at least start the ball rolling in the direction that you're suggesting.
Great.
We definitely hear you, Gina, and I am super pleased that Audrey was able to answer. But yes, we hear you, and we are moving forward with that. We are definitely have a few on the table, and we're looking to see how we can move that forward under YP2LE. It's a start. Absolutely, well heard.
Excellent. Thank you all. Seth, it looks like you have a question. So I will turn it over to you. And I know that some of our faculty may need to leave, and we will allow this to be the final question for the webinar.
Okay, hi. Thanks for having me. I'm Seth from Ghana with the Youth Bridge Foundation. Now, I wanted to find, I think it's very insightful from Audrey, Peter, and Gigi. I mean, I saw Gigi talking about the marginalized community, where you go to the rural communities in Africa, that is the reality facing them. So it balances off where at times digitization moves faster ahead of the youth population. So I think that's very useful. But I think to Audrey and Peter, I wanted to find out the youth segmentation. How mindful are you of the proportion of the youth who are unschooled or those who drop at a very young age, so that we do not make the mistake of lumping all youth into one box? So how mindful are we, and how do we make sure that these cross-sectorial programs take into consideration the barriers that Gigi talked about, and how do we bring them on board to achieve the broader goal? I think that should be that. And like Gina mentioned, we should be looking at more research, delving so much into it. If I should go back again, finally to Gigi, I mean, in the farming community, the cocoa growing communities, the average age is about 55, between 50 and 55, meaning that the youthful population are not interested in agri. So it's instructive to see the introduction, some level of digitization in that space, yet it should be at a pace that we can accommodate them. And for youth livelihood, how do we bring the youth in a country like Ghana, losing the youth not interested in the cocoa industry? Cross-sectorial for many various, I think is very useful. So my question, I'd be grateful to have some clarification. Thank you.
I think those are two questions: the segmentation and the cocoa. No. Does anyone want to answer the segmentation first? Or should I just go?
I can address the segmentation, and
Yeah.
I think, Gigi, I think there's, I don't know the promise of the digital side of this. I mean, I think there could be some. Seth, you're right on. I mean, I got to tell you, we talk a lot about youth engagement, and I think we're tilting in that direction and doing some good things. I mean, the fact is that, in Kenya, what we've tried to do through the youth bunges, and you may be familiar with this. I mean, they're organized, and I don't know, quite frankly, I think there still needs to be capacity building of these young people around leadership and what leadership means and how you reimagine leadership among young Africans today. But I keep talking to them. So for instance, one of the things in Kenya, there's a policy that says 29% of the procurements at the county level need to go to youth. And no county hits that at all. And so I'll often talk to the president of the youth bunge in the county, and I'll say, listen, if I asked you to try and pull together, assemble a group of young people to kind of come up against this, how many could you get? And they'll say, well, probably a couple thousand. I could get a couple thousand to kind of meet here, and we could. I said, okay. I said, how many youth are in this county? Oh, about 500,000. All right, so you're missing a huge opportunity. One, you're missing the opportunity to connect with youth who are disconnected, and that's part of your responsibility as a youth leader. Second of all, you got to think differently. This is the 21st century. So how are you going to mobilize out into the villages to reach those young people that are disconnected? So there's a lot, I think, Seth, around better in educating and enabling youth on the leadership front. I think, the leadership model, and forgive me because I'm the white guy from the US, Seth. But I did listen a lot. I learned so much being in Kenya all this time. But one of the issues on leadership is that basically since colonization, the leadership of the elders, who are the models for the young people, are the old top-down sort of models. Mm-hmm. It's as long as the system works for me and my family and my friends, it's all cool. And so getting a better understanding of leadership today is about facilitative leadership. It's about bringing together differences. It's reaching out to bring those differences together and looking for sort of the core that you can concentrate on. You can get me going on a whole session on the topic of leadership, but I think for me, the segmentation issue is a huge area that has to be addressed. And we're really just getting there. And I don't have all the answers. I think capacity building is one. I try and say to folks, Gina, Gigi, you know, what about technology? You know, I mean, how are you leveraging that? This is the 21st century. You know, you don't have to be meeting all the time. But there's so much we have to sort of break down in order to have a real breakaway strategy on the segmentation piece.
Yeah, I would add just one thing to what Peter is saying, and that's the youth engagement piece. I think there needs to be a lot more intentional engagement of youth in the design process of these programs. I think that a lot of the donors are trying to do that more intentionally, but listening and having that youth voice prominent in the design and implementation, excuse me, is critical. And I think, again, that mindset shift that we come, against, and, getting governments to view youth voices and youth engagement as a critical piece of these programs, I think is going to take time, but it is a mindset shift.
So maybe I know we're at time. I know we're over time, and I like Peter, I can talk about this for a whole day. And I would definitely welcome Seth if you have more questions to get in touch with me. But I just wanted to address the segmentation as well. How we do that in Grameen Foundation. We do gather family profiles, and with that family profiles, we are able to understand what are the role of the children, and different ages of the children in the farming communities. So we also are very cognizant of the fact that there are, child labor issues, in the cocoa sector that we need to be taking care of, and that is something that we could flag, using the digital tools that we are using to capture the family profile information. But on the cocoa itself, we are very much I would say happy to see that the indicators are looking that the younger farmers are really being able to now understand that their farm can be a business by using the digital tools, and just kind of like reinforcing, okay, this, if you do this, this is what happens. If you invest in this, this is what happens. If you don't invest in it, this is what happens. And basically that 7-year plan is something that for cocoa farms is something that has not been done before. It was a close collaboration with Rainforest Alliance and Mars to start with. And it is very important that that youth engaged in business, for that matter, will understand the economics of their business. And that is to us something that needs to be strengthened, especially when we are wanting to involve the youth. Going back to that livelihood point that I made on the last slide that I had, it is very important for us to exhibit that whatever we are doing really points out that they have a future. They have a livelihood to speak of. So in this case, what the tool was able to do was convince younger farmers to actually stay in the farm, and I met an Indonesian farmer. He's 28, and he was saying, I was in Malaysia, I was doing this buy and sell, of clothes on the street. When I came back, I saw that you were doing this plan with my father, 7-year plan, and then I realized, hey, actually we can make money out of our farm if we do this and do that. And so he decided to stay. And he decided to stay instead of going abroad, and going selling clothes in Malaysia. And these are the small stories, but these are indications, that that we can do things, to convince and inspire youth to stay in their farms. Yeah. to start with. Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. We are over time, and I do have to conclude, unfortunately. I wish we could talk about this the whole entire day. It's a great platform. I did post my email in the chat. If there are additional questions that you'd like me to pass along to the panelists, I'm more than happy to do so. Feel free to reach out to me, and thank you all so much for joining. We'll see you at our next webinar, hopefully, which will be in April.